Well, whatever. I was gonna try to get my opening slide up there, but it doesn't seem to want to work. So, all right. Thank you for attending the 2024 uh, Illinois soybean growers webinar series. This is a follow up to our last webinar on the herbicide. Well, it was at the time the draft herbicide strategy. Now it's the final herbicide strategy. Today we'll have our presenter, Dr. Stanley Culpepper. And then following up, we'll have a panel discussion with Kyle Kunkler from ASA and Bridget Rollins from the National Ag Law Center. So with that, Stanley, I'll hand it off to you.
All right, Corey, let's see if I can share my slides, right? I got technology in here with me. Can you see my slides okay?
It looks great.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Great to be back again. My title is the same, Protecting Endangered Species and the Family Farm, but my presentation will be significantly different. Just in case you weren't able to join us at the last presentation or time we were together, I will give a very brief back kind of overview historically, but I'm going to focus the bulk of my time on herbicide strategy, and you're going to see some terms that come up repeatedly through my presentation. I'm going to talk about flexibility. Flexibility is important for us at the farm level. I'm going to talk about complexity. Complexity is not exactly what we want at the farm level, but we're going to have to figure out how to work through it. And then you're going to hear me talking a lot about teamwork, working together, continuing to improve the process. And then I'm hoping, if I am timely, I'm going to have a few minutes at the end for you soybean growers in Illinois. I'm actually going to take you through an example of runoff erosion mitigation, trying to get you the points that you'll need to continue to use the tools you need to control your pests. So if you're an Illinois soybean farmer, get you a pen, pencil, and a piece of paper, because at the end, we're going to have an exercise to try to help you specifically. All right, so if you've seen me before, you've seen this slide. Hopefully this is not new to you. The Endangered Species Act was essentially implemented in 1973, basically to provide framework to conserve and protect endangered and threatened species and their habitats, right? That's a valid approach. What, of course, got complicated for us really occurred in the last 3 or 4 years when litigation pointed out that the US EPA, when registering or re-registering a pesticide, had not followed some of the guidelines, rules, regulations within the Endangered Species Act. And because of that litigation, potentially tools in our toolbox could be completely removed from our access, right? Which would be absolutely devastating. The US EPA responded to that very rapidly. In my opinion, their quick response, they lacked data, they lacked a lot of information. So the regulations and the restrictions that were beginning to be placed on us were simply overwhelming to the point that the practical use of many of our pesticides was being lost. To drive that point home, I'll highlight the draft herbicide strategy, or the proposed herbicide strategy. In my opinion only, this was catastrophic for family farms. It was absolutely catastrophic for our family farm, and I think likely potentially catastrophic for many of yours. Now, it's important we give credit where credit is due. For the last year to year and a half, the EPA has invested a tremendous amount of time not only working with ag stakeholders like Illinois Soybean or ASA, Kyle Kunkler is on here working with him, working with corn, working with soybean, sorghum, and I can go on and on. A lot of agriculture stakeholders are engaged. But importantly to me, they spend a significant amount of time visiting with farmers, actual farmers. And through that engagement, a lot of our regulatory partners, not only US EPA, but Fish and Wildlife, our Department of Agriculture, has got an opportunity to understand what we do on the farm, how we do it, why we do it. That engagement also allowed our farmers to understand some of the many challenges our regulator partners have in fulfilling all the guidelines that are now required to register or re-register a pesticide, right? But through that engagement, I believe was the driver to a completely different, monumentally different final herbicide strategy that has now been finalized. Now, I will remind you, the final herbicide strategy does not impose any restrictions. There's no restriction on you today, but it is the platform or the framework that will be used as the process begins or starts as products go through the registration or re-registration process. So it's not too far out in the distant future before we see some of these rules and regulations being placed on pesticides, starting likely with herbicides as they're moving forward. So if you've had an opportunity to read the final herbicide strategy, that's about 482 pages. You likely will use a lot of adjectives that we will not use today on the Zoom call. But once you make it through the herbicide strategy in all 482 pages, I think two things become very clear. The first thing is flexibility for the farm in regards to buffers for drift, in regards to runoff erosion mitigation measures. Flexibility has increased significantly. Flexibility, again, is very important for us to have at the farm level. Unfortunately, at the same time, highly correlated with the increase in flexibility has been the increase in complexity. This is potentially, and I'm going to underline potentially a lot because it depends on how we handle it, but potentially one of the most complex situations that we will be put on us at the farm level. To expand on that, just to give you an idea, the decisions now will have to be made by field, not by your farm, but by the number of fields you have. So if you're a farmer, start thinking about how many individual fields I have. I will have to make a decision for each of the products I apply on that field as influenced by the crop that is in that field. So think about that. Now, don't fall on the ground, hang in here with me, but the complexity is significant. And when we're making those decisions, remember, there are really two buckets we have to address. We have the runoff mitigation bucket, so we will have to make decisions or calculations regarding runoff mitigation for each pesticide we apply on each of our field. The scale will be, as we've told you a million times, somewhere between 0 and 9 points. Then you will have spray drift buffer bucket. All right. Now, spray drift is going to be influenced by the type of application. Are you a vegetable grower making an air blast application? Are you an agronomic farmer applying a herbicide with a ground rig? Are you applying products aerially? Okay, so each application method will influence the potential buffers that you would end up having. Throughout my discussion today, I am going to focus on the ground rig. All right, I'm a herbicide guy. I'm thinking and hoping most of our herbicides are applied with our ground rigs, keeping that product on target. If you look at the final herbicide strategy, it is predicted that the restrictions will range between 0 and 230 foot as spray drift buffers. So again, each product, I would have to do a calculation to determine, is my buffer 230 feet? Is it 0 feet? All right, so I'm going to take it one step further. And again, hang in there with me. But if you really want to know how many calculations or decisions potentially would have to be made on the farm with one assumption, the assumption here is insecticide strategy and fungicide strategies follow suit of herbicide strategy. I've actually taken 2 farms and made the calculations for you. So this is real world. This took 2 to 3 weeks to do. But how many decisions will farmers have to make? All right, 2 examples. You've got the Culpeper farm in North Carolina. That's a very, very small farm. That farm has 5 agronomic crops. We have 40 fields. And in 2024, we're applying 30 pesticide active ingredients. So again, if herbicide strategy, insecticide strategy, and fungicide strategy were all in place today, following the format of herbicide strategy, we on the farm would have to make 372 runoff decisions or calculations, 372 drift buffer calculations for our very small farm. If you move down to a more dynamic farm in Georgia, 26 unique vegetable crops and agronomic crops. They have 16 agronomic fields. They have 372, believe it or not, vegetable fields. Now, let me explain this to you. All right, so we grow 3 crops per year in a field in my part of the world. So the number of fields grows rapidly because of the production system. So again, we have a tremendous number of fields in our produce regions where we're going to make a lot of decisions. 78 pesticide active ingredients are being applied on this farm on those 26 crops this year. So again, if we're looking for the potential for this farm to make 4,344 runoff 4,344 drift buffer calculations. Now, again, that's significant. And the question really is, who the heck can do that on the farm? Right? I'll flat out say, I don't believe we can even do it on our small farm, much less one of you guys that has a more dynamic operation with many more fields. All right, so we have to simplify this process. And I'm going to share with you some ideas and some concepts of how we can simplify this and still remain sustainable and be able to use the tools that we need to use. Now, I have to break this up again into two buckets. We need to talk about particle drift, and we need to talk about runoff and erosion. I'm going to talk about runoff and erosion and how we're going to meet the mitigation measure requirements first. Okay, so don't get confused. We have to talk about those two separately. I'm going to start again with runoff and erosion. All right, so my goal, and I'm going to share with you my concept, but my goal of how and what we need to do. So I need to, as an advisor, I'm an extension specialist at the University of Georgia, weed scientist, right? I do a lot of cooperative extension meetings, work with a lot of county agents. My goal is to eliminate 90+% of my grower fields in less than 15 minutes. All right, how am I going to do that? This concept relies on me and my county agents as advisors understanding what our farmers do. This concept does not work if I do not understand what my farmers do. But if I understand what my farmers do and I understand herbicide strategy, I'm creative, I have some opportunities to really help my growers. So step one of my goal is I've got to get each of my growers to 9 points on runoff mitigation. Now, why do I want to get to 9 points? If I get my growers to 9 points, they don't have to look on the label for mitigation points. They don't have to look on Bulletins Live 2 for mitigation points. They don't have to make 4,344 decisions on the runoff mitigation measures. I understand it's got to be extremely simple because there's just too many complicated things we're dealing with on the family farm. It really needs to be done in person. We're trying this today online, but it really needs to be done in person. I think we all respect the value of that. Now, for me, I will make really 5 different platforms. I will have 2 agronomic approaches, one for conventional tillage, one for conservation tillage. I won't focus on specialty crops today at all, but I will have to do it completely different for specialty crop growers because the mitigation measures that farmers use in the agronomic world will be completely different in many cases than what we use in the specialty crop world, right? I'm going to give you an example of what I'm planning to do in the agronomic world. Now, for a few minutes, you got to pretend to be a cotton grower in Georgia. At the end, we're going to be Illinois. I'm going to be an Illinois soybean grower with you, but you got to be a cotton grower with me, and you're sitting in a county in Georgia, and I'm coming to your county because that's what we do for an extension meeting, and I'm going to roll in and I'm going to have you a handout similar to what you're looking at, and I'm going to have selected some mitigation measures, not all of them by any choice at all, just the ones that I think are relevant to my conservation tillage production scenario in agronomic crops. With this handout, I'll then walk through it with them. For example, mitigation relief points. Down in the bottom left of the slide, you can see by county how many mitigation relief points. I can't influence that. That is what it is. If you're in South Georgia, you're going to get 2 mitigation relief points for most of our production scenario. So the farmer on the far right of the handout would write in 2 points. Most of our fields have 3% or less slope. We're going to get 2 points there. Sand, loamy sand, or sandy loam soils are very common. I think I've made the point before. We can use your soil to fertilize our soil, right? You won't get credit for the soil texture. I certainly will, so I'll have points there. For my guys that grow cover crops, I know how they grow cover crops, so I know that they will get 3 points. My guys doing conservation tillage, every one of our guys are doing strip till production. So if you're conservation tillage with a cover crop, we're going to get 3 points for the cover crop, 2 points for strip till production. Pretty simple. If you're not irrigated, you have no irrigation, you're going to get 3 points. If you have irrigation, 50% of my guys have irrigation, 50% don't. The ones that don't, I don't get any points there, but right below that, if you look at incorporation with a center pivot, I have to do it the right way, and I'll expand on that later. But if I do it the right way, I can get a point there. Around many of our small fields, we have vegetation surrounding the field. They're basically field borders. If it's a 20-foot border, I get 1 point. If it's bigger than that, I get more points, right? So I think all of these are relevant to conservation tillage producers in Georgia. I'm not focusing on 50 different things. I'm focusing on those that I think are important. And I'm trying to get each of my guys to 9 points. Mitigation tracking at the bottom. Again, I will hand you a grower this form out. You fill it out. That is mitigation tracking. You are getting 1 point for mitigation tracking. So then I will ask my growers, hey, if you've got 9 points, you're good. See you later. Go home. If you don't have 9 points, I have things in my back pocket that I really don't want to use, but we can use them. We can be creative. We do have flexibility. Here's some examples of some things for Georgia farmers that are available, but I don't really want to use them. I'll give you an example if you look at number 2. I can be an expert. I can be an expert for our growers and I can get them a point. I don't want to be their expert. They don't want me to be their expert because it's going to take us a lot of time and effort that neither one of us want to have to use. If we need to, we will, but let's do that with 2% of the growers, not 100% of the growers, right? If you move down to the bottom, again, I'm trying to avoid this, but this is a big one in our back pocket. Rate of product applied. This is important that you understand this. In runoff and erosion, the rate of product applied is based on the annual max, the annual amount for the year for that product, not a single application. I can't think of any herbicide I recommend in agronomic crops where I am close to the annual maximum amount for the year. Okay, so there are a lot of points there, but you can see how you would have to work with each farmer. What rate are you applying? Which product is it? It's very complicated, but there are points there that if we have 3% of our farmers that need help, no problem. But again, let's try to remove as many of our farmers and as many of our fields as we can with the bigger items. And again, those of you using the new technology where you're treating only percents of fields, there are a lot of points there. It just requires a little bit more effort and calculations for you to figure that out. But we do have a lot of things in the back pocket. Now, I'm going to expand that just a little bit for my growers when I'm in the county meeting, but maybe 7 or 8 minutes, I just covered conservation tillage. Here's an example for conventional tillage. It's different. I have different mitigation options available for conventional tillage growers. I would then go through the same concept, the same process with them, trying to get them to 9 points. My goal is I have to get everybody to 9 points, at least on my concept. And again, we'll walk through this at the end of my presentation using an Illinois soybean example. So you might say, well, I don't have advisor. I don't have the cooperative extension service. What am I going to do? Or maybe you're an advisor and you say, well, I don't understand this good enough to help my grower yet. Well, I am very excited about one tool the US EPA is developing. They're calling it a runoff erosion calculator. This calculator has the potential, and I'm going to stress potential, to be very helpful. It is going to be very creative and it's going to be very easy to use if they get this right. The final product's not out yet, so we've got to hold that compliment too much, but it has the potential to help you greatly. It will be far better than you trying to read 482 pages of herbicide strategy or trying to work through the tables that are presented in herbicide strategy. The other thing that I think is maybe even more important is what if you don't understand what a mitigation measure is? I just showed you strip till. You guys probably don't use strip till because you don't have a hard pan. If you don't know what it is, how are you supposed to find out? Well, in the calculator, there's strip till. You click on strip till, it gives you the definition of strip till. So it's an educational tool that also will help you calculate the points that you can obtain with different mitigation measures. I think it's going to be a wonderful asset for you, the grower, if you want to get into it, but definitely for us as advisors who are helping you, the grower. And it'll also remove a lot of stress in trying to decide, am I right about this? Am I wrong about this? The calculator will make sure that we're making the right decision. So not out yet, coming out soon. It will continue to evolve, but I'm excited about the calculator for the runoff erosion. I think it's going to be a wonderful tool for us. All right, now let's move on and leave the runoff erosion bucket. Let's talk about particle drift. This has been what I have been screaming about for 3 years. There's no way we can remain sustainable if we can't utilize the entire field. And if you look at this, the part of the slide on the left, I've showed you this before. For 3 years, we have been sending this type of information to our regulatory partners on Depending on how large the infield buffer is, here's an example of 240-foot downwind buffer infield. Depending on the shape and the size of the field, we lose somewhere between 20 and 33% of our farms if that buffer ends up in the crop. All right, I've been stressing the importance of that. Now, the EPA and the final herbicide strategy, again, for ground rigs, it's different for aerial, air blast, etc. But for ground rigs, they are suggesting 230 foot would be the worst case scenario. So ironically, that kind of works out with our 240 foot. But this 230 foot is, again, an absolute worst case scenario, and we have some opportunity to be creative. The EPA got this right on the way they started. The first place they start, they talk about and focus on boom height and droplet size. They're the first two places you need to start to reduce off-target spray drift. If you use a low boom, and low boom in this scenario is 24 inches above the ground with coarse droplets, you get a 75% reduction in that buffer. So, and again, I'm going to assume 230 feet. If I can get 230 foot down to zero, then for every ground application, I don't have to go spend a tremendous amount of time on 70 or 80 different pesticide labels trying to figure out where I'm at least herbicide wise. If you can't do a low boom at 24 inches, you're higher than that. You can see the high boom with the larger droplets, you get 65% reduction and so on. I wanted to show you this data from Georgia because, again, you've got to give credit where credit is due. The EPA has gotten this right. What I'm doing is I'm showing you real world data in the field, all these applications going on at one time, and I'm showing you the distance of spray drift that caused injury as influenced by boom height and droplet size. Let's first look at the red bars versus the yellow bars. You're looking at the medium droplet in red bars. That number 188 feet is how far that product drifted with the boom height 48 inches above the target. If you compare that to the yellow bar, you can clearly see the ultra coarse droplet, the amount of drift that is occurring. You know this is monumentally less. If you look within color, it doesn't matter if you look at the medium droplet or the larger droplet. What you see when you take that boom height from 48 inches to 24 inches, you basically cut the drift in half, right? You need to have your boom 24 inches above your target. It improves coverage. It improves weed control. It reduces off-target movement. You need to be doing this no matter what. There are exceptions. Hey, if I got a terrace in the field, I can't necessarily do that. But other than those exceptions, this is a goal that each of us should strive for every day. All right, so I think they got this right. Now, I do want to highlight, and I told you, we've got to continue to work for improvements. There is one challenge with this low boom coarse droplet as defined in herbicide strategy. Low boom is defined as 24 inches above the soil. All right, so think about that. That don't work for a post-emergence herbicide when the soybeans are 15 inches tall. We are working with the US EPA and other regulatory partners to try our best to get that changed to 24 inches above the ground or crop canopy. That is what we need. That is what the data supports. That needs to be the message that we all send. 24 inches above crop canopy or the ground is the best thing to steward every pesticide out there, herbicide-wise, that we apply. All right, so I wanted to add that in there. That is not done. We got to work on that. More to do, but we have time to do it. If you move down to the bottom, we now get credit for DRAs. It's influenced by droplet size. If you're applying a coarse droplet and you add a DRA, you'll get a 15% additional reduction. In my part of the world, the relative humidity is rarely below 60%. So at least in my part of the world, I will get 10%. And I'm thinking you guys during the summer have a significant relative humidity as well. So if I'm doing a low boom, we got to fix the low boom definition, but let's assume we do. If we do the low boom, coarse droplet, DRA, relative humidity, I have a 100% reduction in my drift. So I took 230 foot down to zero. All right, I did this, and I'll say for a Georgia farmer, but doing exactly what I need to do anyway. So they got this right. Now, let's say we can't fix the low boom definition and we have to go high boom. Now, all of a sudden, I have a 23-foot buffer that I need to work on and not make sure it's not in my field, right? There are additional options. Thank the EPA so much for adding different application methods. I know the hooded sprayer is probably, rotomitter sprayer doesn't influence you. The lay-by rig probably doesn't influence you, but they were both newly added, very important to us in the Southeast. You may use a broadcast hooded boom. That's a 50% reduction. You'll look at the table. In the table, I want to point out rate of product can provide you credit, but the rate of product in the particle drift is not going to work out for us as much as it does at runoff and erosion. The rate of product here to get credit is influenced on the single application amount. Products like dicamba, 2,4-D, Liberty, Roundup, you're using the maximum single amount. You don't need to change that. You need to continue with a sustainable program with pest management. That is critical. So there are not as many points in the back pocket here as there is for runoff and erosion. There are some benefits. I know you guys don't have a lot of windbreaks. In Georgia, we can get a lot of potential for windbreaks. And the big one for me, a lot of our fields are surrounded by trees. Those fields that are surrounded by a forest or shrubland, at least 60 foot wide, twice as high as the boom, I get another 100%. So many of my fields, I went from having hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet infield buffers with the proposed strategy to having a 200% credit on what I'm sitting here looking at now. Now, don't fret too much. Also remember there are managed areas adjacent to the treated field that your buffer can be on instead of in your field. This is not the whole list. Again, I am simplifying this for the Georgia farmer. These are the 4 that are relevant to my farmers. There are more options, but you guys, a big one. If you have an adjacent ag field that you're not treating, that ag field can be the buffer, right? Roads, grassy areas, bare ground around our fields, we got 20, 30 feet sitting there, right? So you have a lot of opportunity. You have more flexibility. You just have to be creative in the process. All right, now I want to talk just a second before we get into the Illinois soybean example for runoff and erosion. I want to talk a second about continued improvement, continued engagement, continued teamwork. It is absolutely paramount. You've heard me talk. I focused a lot of my presentation last time about we have to get the maps right. We have to understand where the species are at. We have to understand where our fields are at. Understanding where they both are at helps us understand the overlap or the potential harm of a pesticide we apply to our field to a species. Now, I've showed you the data with the salamanders where we went from 951,557 acres of a footprint of a restriction down to 3,500 acres. The mapping process is not going to be that successful on most species, so be clear about that. But the mapping process is going to improve the science behind where these species are at, help us understand where we need to protect them. For herbicide strategy, and we think insecticide strategy and fungicide strategy, if we can get you to 9 points on runoff and mitigation, and for a ground application, we get you to 230 feet, we're going to protect you from what's called a PULA. PULA is a pesticide use limitation area, right? We're getting you to the worst case scenario. These pesticide use limitation areas are going to be the worst case scenarios. And remember, most of our pesticides won't be a 9. Most of our pesticides won't be 230 feet buffer. But if we can get you there, we can protect you from most of the PULA scenarios, even within the herbicide strategy, insecticide strategy, and fungicide strategy. Now, we've got a curveball. There's always a daggum curveball. We're trying to simplify this as much as possible. And just last week, if you look down in the bottom right, you'll see the Vulnerable Species Action Plan. This Vulnerable Species Action Plan is going to have to be handled a little bit different than everything I've talked about. And the key to this is the mapping. We need the maps to refine these species very, very scientifically accurate. This action plan focuses on highly vulnerable species, right? Those that are the most vulnerable to being lost. Where herbicide strategy focuses on runoff and drift, these also include volatility and bioaccumulation. So there is a potential that the protection measures, if your farm ends up under where a vulnerable species action plan is at, there may have to be additional things. Now, again, if we can get you to 9 points, we can get you to 230, we're already setting up to be in a great place, but we have to be prepared. There could be some curveballs. We don't know what kind of curveball is going to come out because the EPA has promised us that the restrictions and regulations from the Vulnerable Species Action Plan will not begin until the map refinement process is finalized. And again, kudos where the EPA deserves it, the investment they are making for the map refinement is monumental, absolutely monumental. All right, let's take just a few minutes and then I'm going to shut up. I want to walk you through an example. So if you're an Illinois soybean farmer, you get your pen, get your paper, and let's do this together. Now, this may fail miserably. I have been in exactly one soybean field in Illinois. I am from a family farm in northeastern North Carolina that grows soybeans. So I understand soybean production, but not in Illinois. Okay, so let's walk through this. We're going to focus on runoff and erosion. We're going to try to get you to 9 points. You do not have an intelligent advisor in this scenario. You simply have me. And what I'm actually trying to do is I'm trying to represent what the calculator is going to do for you. Okay, because I'm really excited about the calculator. So mitigation relief points. All right. You would click in mitigation relief points. You would put your county in. That calculator will tell you exactly how many points you have. Today, if you're in an orange county, write down 2 points. If you're in a dark blue county, write down 3 points. If you're light blue, I'm sorry. There's nothing we can do about that. Next, I'm thinking most of your fields are less than 3% slope. You understand 3% slope. If you're a 3% slope, write a 2 down. All right, so hopefully most of you are sitting at 4 points. We have to get to 9. Now, one thing is important, and this is the farm boy coming out of me. The mitigations I'm getting ready to go through, our definition of a mitigation measure may not be exactly the same as that as the EPA defines. Okay, we have little creative ideas and ways, but when it comes down to this scenario, we have to run off of their definitions. Now, let me be clear. Ag stakeholders are very engaged with the EPA and the terminology that they're using with mitigation measures, the definitions they're using, all right? So they're not leaving us out. We're engaged, we're involved, and hopefully the process will get better, but we have to understand their mitigation measures. And I'll give you an example. The calculator will do this for you. Cover crops, all right? So if you're a cover crop person and you click on cover crops, you're gonna have 3 options. You're gonna have the tilled cover option, where basically you planted a cover crop, but you terminated it with tillage. If so, you would get 1 point. So write 1 point down. If you're a short duration cover, so you planted it in the fall, it winter died, it winter killed, or you planted it in the spring, you're not getting much cover, you can still get 2 points. If you're in the southeast like I am, we plant in the fall, it's very aggressive growing, we have residue on the ground year round, we will get 3 points. All right, so write down whatever it is. That one field I went into didn't have a cover crop, so it would get no points. Conservation tillage, same scenario. You have 4 production methods you will get to choose from. Now, the overall key to conservation tillage is you must maintain 30% cover on the ground, period. All right, if you don't have the 30% cover, you have to say no here. But if you have 30% cover, then if you no-till, I think this no-till definition fits right in with what we call it on the farm, you would get 3 points. Those of you not familiar with strip till, it's basically defined as a tillage strip. We have to run a ripper shank to bust open a hard pan. As long as that tillage strip is less than 1/3 of the row width, I'm getting 2 points. Every one of my conservation tillage guys will get 2 points. If you do mulch till, the entire soil surface is tilled, but we leave a uniform layer of crop residue, which is actually what happened in the one field that I was in Illinois with soybean because they had corn everywhere. They would get 2 points. So again, write down how many points that you would get. Non-irrigated lands, I don't think we need to define that. If you don't have irrigation, you get 3 points. All right. If you do have irrigation or you have that center pivot I mentioned earlier, there is a little caveat to this, right? You got to get either non-irrigated or potentially one for irrigated. If you have overcarried irrigation, you can get 1 point as long as you irrigate within 24 hours without runoff. And you may not like this, but this is a good thing. And this is justified with science for several reasons, but I will argue if we're putting a herbicide out, we want to activate the daggum herbicide. We don't want it sitting there breaking down. So you need to do this anyway. So let's take the point and do what we need to do for better pest management. The one caveat is the product must not be pre-plant incorporated only. So it's got to have a pre-emergence use or a post-emergence use. And this is, I don't want to go into it, but it's actually real because if it's only a PPI application or pre-plant incorporated application, the mitigation credit has already been added in the process of registration, right? I think the only product I can think of is Treflan. There may be some other ones like Eptam. There may be a few examples, but I don't think this is a real limiting factor for us. Vegetated ditch, Again, just showing you some examples. Their definition is a ditch covered with vegetation that transports surface water without runoff, without erosion, right? You've got to fit the capacity. Only you would know that. If you have a vegetative ditch around your fields, you've got those ditches in there, it meets that criteria, you get a point. If you don't, you move on to the next one. Mitigation tracking. If you're actually writing down, you're a soybean farmer and you're writing down what we're doing, we are mitigation tracking. You get 1 point. Now, here's the only complicated thing for you in this category. All right, you have to cover every one of your fields. If every one of your fields are exactly the same, you can do it once. All right, you can group them. We have 40 fields. 36 of my fields are the same. I'm going to lump them and do all 36 under one document. All right. The 4 other fields I have to do separately because the mitigation credits I need will be slightly different. But you can simplify that as much as possible based on the similarity of the fields. And then the last one I'll just mention, I'm not going to go through the definition. I think we know what contour planting is. We know what a terrace is. We know what grass waterways is. If you have any of those, each one is 2 points. So if you have terraces and grass waterways, that's 4 points. So the question is, do you have 9 points for all of your fields? If you have 9 points for all of your fields, you're good today before the first restriction is ever put on the first label. If you're not, remember we have a lot of other opportunities to help you. I also don't understand Illinois soybean production, so there are lots of other opportunities in the calculator or that your advisor can work with you to try to address. So taking it home, I think the key, especially over the next year, is for us to identify growers not having enough mitigation options. There are other options that need more science to support to get into the process. We can do that if we need to, but we need to know how much effort needs to be invested, and only the farmers going through the process can tell us that. It's critical that we maintain a unified outreach effort. All right, we do not need Illinois soybean, ASA, and your extension service telling you something different. We all have to be on the same page. This is too complex. I just want to remind you this vulnerable species action plan, we have to watch that curveball. We have to see where it falls out. We may have to work with those fields very directly and specifically depending on the species and the location. But we need a team approach certainly to support you, the farmer. All right. Now, I will challenge you, the farmer. Look at how much effort has gone into protecting and trying to prevent the loss of the tools you need in your toolbox. You have got to do your part. You have got to make the effort to put these products on target and keep them there. I work with farmers every day. My dad's a farmer. Everybody I know is a farmer. Smartest people on the planet. If you want to do it, you will do it. You have got to be committed to doing your part. That is very, very critical. All right, Corey, I'm going to try to figure out how to stop sharing. Did I stop sharing, buddy?
You did, and I am going to try to successfully share my PowerPoint now. Hopefully. There we go. So again, thank you guys for being part of this. And I just want to remind everyone that this webinar and the following panel is going to be supported by the Illinois soybean growers. If you're not a member, I encourage you to hit the QR code on the screen and find out about membership benefits and how to become a member. I will at this time say that if you are a CCA, you can hit the QR code on the screen to get your CEUs. And with that, we're going to transition over to our panel discussion. And so Bridget and Kyle, are you both on? And Stanley, you can stay on too, buddy. You're part of the panel discussion. I saw your video went dead. We have so many good questions, and that was great. I love the soybean specific, Illinois soybean specific breakdown. And Dr. Culpepper, I'll just say, if you've only been in one Illinois soybean field, we are happy to invite you up here anytime. We'll get you in all of them you want to see. But
Thank
that
you.
said, I know you work a lot with Dr. Aaron Hager at University of Illinois, and he's been in all the soybean fields in Illinois that anybody wants to see. So we do have expertise here locally too. So with that, Bridget, you're with the National Ag Law Center based in the University of Arkansas, but a USDA funded program. And Kyle, everyone on the call knows who you are, American Soybean Association, Regulatory Policy Director. And so, Bridget, I just want to kick off the panel discussion. First, I'll invite farmers or anyone on the call to submit questions in the QA, and we will get to them. but I'm just going to kick off the conversation with you, Bridget. And so, one conversation that I have a lot with farmers when I talk about this issue and other pesticide issues is, well, that's fine, but no one's going to enforce this. And it kind of brings up this question about applying pesticides off label. And so, from a legal perspective, I just wondered if you could help address that question of what are the legal consequences for soybean growers applying off label their pesticide products off label. What does that mean?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Corey, and thank you for having me today. And I'm so glad we started with that because I noticed in the Q&A someone had asked about enforcement as well. And they'd specifically asked whether or not enforcement had been built into this herbicide strategy. So I think I'll just jump off by saying not specifically into the strategy itself because, and I'm sure Kyle or Dr. Culpepper can step in if they feel like I'm missing an aspect of this here, but EPA is intending to enforce this the same way that they enforce any other labeling requirements under FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. So something that comes up, this is a truism. You hear this so many times if you talk about pesticide law and enforcement, but there's just saying, if you haven't heard it before, the label is the law. So what that means is that under FIFRA, the idea is that anything that's put on a pesticide label, any instruction, any warning statement is considered to be incorporated into federal law, to be essentially part of FIFRA, which means that violating a label instruction is going to be considered a violation of federal law. It's going to be considered a violation of FIFRA, which means it's going to be enforceable by EPA or I think it's usually EPA that enforces FIFRA. Now, realistically, how easy is it for EPA to carry out an enforcement action, right? That can really depend. It depends on, right, how egregious, let's just say, how extreme maybe the deviation from the label is, how easy is it to trace that back to a particular applicator. But when we think about some of our, right, tracking and monitoring requirements, important to take that into account. So to answer that question, all of these new mitigations, right? Once they start appearing on labels, as Dr. Culpepper said, under the finalized herbicide strategy, we're going to start seeing these new mitigations appear on labels as one, new products are registered for the first time under FIFRA, and two, as EPA carries out registration review. So as we start to see these appear on labels, they will be considered incorporated into the label. The label is the law. So EPA will be enforcing this under FIFRA, and I think we're going to probably see that carry out the way that we usually see enforcements under FIFRA carry out.
Bridget, thank you. And I love that almost slogan, the label is the law,
The
right? So
label is the law.
that's a great answer to that question. Um, Kind of building on that thought pattern, and it seems to me that a lot of this is going to mean that the label is the law, and following that law is going to become increasingly more complicated. And so one of those questions is around ESA labels specifically. And so I'm just wondering, from your legal background, can you comment on, are there any elements of the Endangered Species Act that specifically make it more prone to litigation? That's something we hear a lot about. And then, are there actually any legal protections built into either FIFRA or ESA to into the pesticide process more broadly that will actually help protect farmers? Can you comment on those thoughts?
No, that's a great question. And that's something I've been getting asked for the last couple of years as as EPA has been working to develop this policy. So for the Endangered Species Act, it's kind of an interesting and unique act. So there's a thing under the ESA, we see it come up in various environmental law statutes called a citizen suit provision. So, what this means is that the ESA authorizes citizens, me, you, environmental groups, whoever, to file or initiate a lawsuit under the ESA, right? So, the idea is that a citizen does not have to go to the government to ask the government to enforce the act. The citizen can take action on their own. And they can take that action against, right? Again, another citizen, me, you. They can take that action against the government. That's how we see a lot of suits against EPA filed by environmental groups under the ESA. We see a lot of those come up through there. But essentially, that's a unique thing that, or not unique to the ESA, but a something that you don't see all the time is the citizen suit provision. Now, for farmers who are looking at, could someone file a lawsuit against me for, right, maybe failing to comply with one of these new mitigation requirements? As Dr. Culpepper showed, right, there's a lot of complexity there. It's not unlikely that we're going to see folks who are trying their best to comply not be able to fully, right, adhere to all those new requirements, at least not on the first go around. It's one thing to initiate a citizen suit. It's another thing to be successful, right? So the Endangered Species Act has both civil and criminal penalties for violating the act. I can tell you right now, to get to the biggest, worst, consequences, you have to have purposefully, on purpose, knowingly, 100% decided, I'm going to wake up this morning and go clearly, obviously violate the Endangered Species Act. Something like a farmer who has tried their best to comply with a FIFRA label and maybe didn't quite make it really is not something that we are worried about kind of seeing courts crack down on. I honestly would be very surprised to even see environmental groups or environmentally minded citizens waste all that time, all that money, all those resources on trying to pursue such a case. That said, I think where maybe we could see some lawsuits further down the road under the ESA targeting aspects of this policy would be challenges to the policy itself brought by environmental groups for, you know, I could see an argument that environmental groups might make to say this policy itself does not comply with the Endangered Species Act, but that's a completely different kettle of fish and maybe better for another conversation. But for farmers on the ground, I think, again, unless you are specifically waking up and deciding to purposefully go out and egregiously, obviously, with ample evidence, violate the Endangered Species Act, I'm not terribly concerned about seeing lawsuits based on, right, these new labeling restrictions being filed against individual growers.
Bridget, and that again, amazing information there, and you kind of led into a question I had, which was, do we even know with certainty that this strategy, the following strategies, are actually going to meet the ESA obligations the EPA has? And you kind of answered it, right? There's already doubt
Yep.
in that question, and so, but that does kind of lead to, from my perspective, you spoke about the environmental groups pushing ESA or EPA to do things through legal action. I often wonder about the reverse. Looking at the herbicide strategy and how it's been rolled out currently, or how it's going to roll out, are there any legal challenges that you see that ag groups might be able to bring up specifically, whether it's under ESA or under FIFRA? Any
I,
thoughts there?
I love that you asked this question because this is something that me and my team, this is a conversation we've been having internally and a question that we've been asked as well. Right now, I think the answer is we just don't know yet what challenges ag could raise to this, or what the best challenge should be. So to challenge something like this in court, a plaintiff, the person kind of bringing the lawsuit, has to have what we know in the legal community as standing. They have to have basically the ability to bring that suit into court, to have it heard by a court of law. And typically standing makes up it's made up of three separate elements. The plaintiff needs to have suffered some kind of concrete injury. The defendant's behavior needs to sort of, they need to be able to say it's the defendant's behavior caused this injury. And then the third thing is that the court needs to be able to redress it. So with environmental groups, what we see happen is they're able to raise lawsuits under the ESA or under something called the Administrative Procedure Act, which I won't get into, but essentially it allows these groups to raise these lawsuits saying, hey, the federal government, you did this thing and you did not fully comply with the statute the way that you were supposed to. That has caused us to suffer some kind of injury to our interests or to the interests of our members. And the court has the ability to redress it. So it's possible we could see that in an ag context. We could see maybe ag groups be able to file a lawsuit saying, the federal government did not fully comply with the law, or as we might see now after, and again, this is very legalese, I'm giving a very high overview definition. What we might see, and we have to remember, we're now operating in a world without Chevron deference, where courts have a lot more ability to interpret statutes, especially if the language is ambiguous or does not clearly authorize steps that the federal government is taking. Again, this could be beneficial or not, depending on the court or the judge you're in front of. But that could be a way that we might be able to see ag groups have an easier time getting into court with this, to be able to say EPA misinterpreted EPA or misinterpreted FIFRA, or it is doing something that is not clearly authorized by FIFRA or the Endangered Species Act, and it is harming, it's causing injury to our interests, it's causing injury to the interests of our members, and it's something that the court could resolve. And what could that injury be? As Dr. Culpepper said, right, we're going to be seeing changes to how growers, how you all apply your pesticides. That could have an economic impact. It could cause you to expend more resources. It could cause you to have to perhaps fallow or no longer use some of your fields that you had previously used in a particular way for a particular purpose. So that is a possibility. I'm personally going to be very interested to see which group files a lawsuit first and what legal arguments they make. But from the discussions I've had with my team, that seems like the most obvious route. Although, again, it's possible that we'll see something else come up. And Kyle, I don't know if this is a conversation that you all have been having, but I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Extensively.
So Bridget, I might have queued up that question with you to transition to Kyle.
Perfect.
So I will say again, very informative. I think there's a lot of details there. I love that you mentioned Chevron, which I think is a huge question for a lot of our growers. What does Chevron mean? I know you and I had a conversation just last week about how Chevron can have good consequences for growers, but also it's a double-edged sword. There's potential for negative consequences. And so it really has changed the ball game when it comes to a lot of topics in ag. With that, though, I know we're getting some good farmer questions. I do want to transition to Kyle real fast or real slow, whatever. Kyle Kunkler, Regulatory Director for American Soybean Association. Kyle, just kind of building off Bridget's conversation there. Can you just comment a little bit? I know you're on the forefront of a lot of the national level organizing from farm groups on this issue. Can you just comment a little bit about how that looks, what that looks like on a national level, and then maybe mention some of our allies and maybe what are some key challenges?
Sure. Thanks, Corey. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today for Illinois Soybean Association for holding these incredibly valuable webinars. Thank you all for doing this. From a national perspective, the farmer grower organizations are very closely well aligned. We've been really working closely with our colleagues from across the United States, from row crops, corn, cotton, wheat, sorghum, to a lot of the fruit, vegetable, specialty crop groups as well, who I think, as Dr. Culpepper noted, actually may stand to potentially be impacted by these proposals even more than row crops. Many of the mitigations that have been proposed are better suited for row crops. And that's something that we've historically noticed, that many of our colleagues in the fruit and vegetable space, there just aren't as many options that have been provided for them to comply with. Is it getting better? It is. But you also think about, as Dr. Culpepper noted, some of those folks, if you're talking a smaller field, fruit and vegetable field or an orchard or something like that, if you're having to put in place significant buffers or pulling out, some of those trees to put in, riparian or edge of field areas, it's going to have a much bigger impact on their operations even than it might on ours. So they've been very, very concerned, and we've been working very closely and collaboratively with them. And I think the message is the proposals are trending in a better direction, as Dr. Culpepper noted, but we're still very, very significantly concerned about the complexity of the proposal. I couldn't agree with Dr. Culpepper more that while we are seeing increases in flexibility, that is also trending in a direction of complexity. And does it place, farmers or applicators in a position where they could face increased legal jeopardy or risks against themselves, their operations? because these are just becoming very challenging to comply with. And it won't be evenly distributed either. Some folks in some areas are going to face easier implementation challenges than others. And to get to that sort of, we're operating into the assumption that, look, if you've got 4 crops in rotation and you're going to need 50, 60 different chemistries, one of them is going to probably be at 9 points somewhere along the way. You're not going to go put in place a 30-foot riparian buffer and then tear it out the very next growing season because you don't no longer need those points, right? You're going to play to whatever sort of chemistry you need in your operation that's going to require the most points. And that could cost significantly to do that for field to field, to make sure that you're getting all those, to getting all those fields up to snuff. And we're concerned about the costs of those and impacts on growers. So transitioning, how does that impact what we're doing? Well, we are continuing to push on EPA, engaging with USDA, lawmakers on the Hill to make sure that we can get this to the right place. But as Bridget and you discussed a moment ago, it's not lost on us too that this very well could likely be transitioning into a new phase of legal challenge, and we're making sure that we're adequately preparing for that and engaging with our colleagues to make sure that we're not caught flat-footed should this transition in that direction.
So Kyle, that's a really interesting transition point right there. Mentioning coordination on a legal front. Do you have any? Can you share any updates on? Are the ag organizations doing anything specifically to develop a legal strategy moving forward, or
Yep.
I'll let you comment.
Yeah. We're having very close in extensive discussions with a number of our colleagues across the row crop and specialty crop space. We're also talking with folks in the non-agricultural use space as well. I mean, keep in mind, these tools are used by everything from mosquito control to landscapers to those, doing invasive species management. There's a lot of folks that are going to be impacted by these proposals, and we're talking with all of them. I will say this, taking a step back here for a second, we want EPA to be compliant. It has been incredibly disruptive the last couple decades. Every time a court ruling comes down and we lose tools, sometimes at very opportune moments that are disruptive for agriculture. We can't have that. We have to help EPA figure out a way to become compliant. But that being said, we're very mindful and got to make sure that this isn't going to be putting, Century Farms out of business. And that's something that we're continuing to work towards as well. And EPA, give credit where it's due. This is a really, really hard thing to do. There's almost 1,700 listed species. And if you have to do this, consider the impact for every single active ingredient on them, hundreds of times over for hundreds of species, that's really hard to do. I understand why EPA has not historically done this. We've got to figure it out. But that being said, it's one thing for them to now make a commitment and realize, hey, we'll wake up one day and realize, okay, we're going to do this. Now, actually fulfilling that may actually be a lot harder. They don't have to just do it. It's not enough just to do the work and put in place the requirements. It also has to be consistent with the law. And we've sat down and kind of thought about this. Well, what all of the different legal obligations that they have to make sure that this is consistent with their responsibilities? And there are a lot. I mean, they have to, there are provisions within the EPA or in the Endangered Species Act itself. These mitigations have to be reasonable and prudent. That's the standard that they have to meet. If they end up putting farms out of business, I would contend that they probably aren't meeting that standard. They have to use the best available science when determining what these mitigations are without going down a rabbit hole. Suffice it to say, we don't think that they're meeting that responsibility right now. Under FIFRA, they have to consider, and which, by the way, these might be Endangered Species Act related restrictions, but they're doing this work under FIFRA. And if you're doing it under FIFRA, they have to consider both the risks and benefits of those pesticide uses before they can put in place restrictions. We don't think that they're adequately doing that. We'll see more when they start integrating this into registration decisions here in the coming months, whether they're adequately considering benefits, but we've notified them, you better be considering those benefits because you have an obligation to do so under the law. I could go on. They have, under the Administrative Procedures Act, this has to be not arbitrary and capricious. they have to have justifications and reasons for why they're doing what they're doing. We are monitoring very closely whether they're providing that sufficient detail. There are potential constitutional claims. If you're depriving landowners of the ability to use economic use of their land, especially in rural areas where you may not have any alternative uses, there are potential Fifth Amendment regulatory takings claims that might be at play here. There are other statutes, such as, for example, the Regulatory Flexibility Act, where Congress told agencies, if you're going to be putting in place regulations, you have to consider what those impacts are going to be on small businesses, including small farms, and consider possible flexibilities that you could entertain to make sure they're not going to be impacted by regulations. Again, I could go on and on and on. And EPA has an obligation to, whatever they put in place, make sure that it's going to meet every single one of those tests, or they're placing themselves at jeopardy.
So
And again, I want to say one last quick thing is really, we truly do want them to be compliant, but that doesn't mean just simply doing ESA and meeting those responsibilities. They have to meet all of their responsibilities.
right. And Kyle, I appreciate that really detailed breakdown of some of the potential challenges there. And it's good to know that EPA has been, I guess, notified or put on record as, hey, you have to do all of this. And so I love hearing about that work from the American Soybean Association. So with that, I do want to transition to, I know we're over 8. I want to transition to some of our farmer questions. Dr. Culpepper, I think most of these are targeted at you, but panelists, I would invite you all to comment as well. One question, though, I did have texted to me, and this is kind of a broad question. Knowing that you don't have a crystal ball and you don't know the future, can you kind of speculate on when farmers will actually start seeing these ESA labels on products? I mean, do they need to start making changes before the 2025 growing season? And then maybe what products specific to soybean production are we most worried about seeing?
Yeah, so Kyle actually, I think, said it a minute ago. I think we'll start seeing some stuff rolling in a few months, right? I don't think it will be your most common or most utilized products for soybean production off the get-go. I think we've got a little more time for that. I don't want to list any product names because I'll be wrong. And Kyle can cut his mute off and join in here. But I think we'll start seeing it. And actually, I think there's going to be a couple of products. We'd actually like for it to come in on a few products that maybe aren't our most important products. So we can, number one, make sure everything that's been shared with us is the same as when it comes out, right? Because sometimes things tend to change and often not in a good way, right? So we want that experience. But he said in a few months, it may be a few months plus some on some products that will get an opportunity to experience. But I don't think, excuse the terminology, but I don't think any of our heavy hitters are on the front line of going through. I think it's going to be registration products early on, re-registration products. And if you're a herbicide guy, it's re-registration that's important to you. We're going to have quite a while. So we've got time.
Yeah.
Kyle, anything? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is if you're using Enlist right now, you're already under this regime. Go take a look at your label. There are ESA requirements already built into that new Enlist registration, and maybe your applicators are aware of that, or if you're working with crop consultants or anything like that, they're probably helping you out to that end. But those mitigations are already on there, and in some instances, where there are a handful of products that already do have these mitigations in place. We have seen them generally be reasonable, and farmers have had not a terrible degree of difficulty implementing them. So as Dr. Culpepper noted, we're going to see more and more of those get proposed in the months to come. Now, keep in mind, they're only going to start getting proposed first, and then we're going to get to see how closely EPA is tracking with what they've finalized in the herbicide strategy, with how they're going to start baking that into registrations. And we and other groups, Illinois Soy and others, will have the chance to comment on those as well. So, this isn't done. Like there's still going to be more phases to go here, but we'll start to get a clearer picture. And if I had to guess, so one last quick aside, EPA has an obligation under FIFRA to re-register every single product that's currently on the market by October 2026. They're probably not going to meet that deadline. Call it a hunch. They'll probably need more time, but they're still going to operate under the assumption that they have to do that. So I think that we'll start to see over the next year more of these get proposed more quickly that have these included in them. And that'll give us a clearer picture, probably, for 2025, 2026 and beyond, just really what this is going to look like.
And I would just like to jump in really quickly to build off something that Kyle said. A question that we've started getting and at my office is coming from folks who are wondering, is there a great way to look and see which products are coming down the pike next, right? Which products are up for registration review? Which products are we going to start seeing this on first? And the answer is, at least as far as we're aware, there's not a really great system. EPA does have resources on its website that can let you know, this product is currently undergoing registration review, and we estimate it will be completed at this time. But if you have watched them go through, say, the registration review for glyphosate, you know that schedule is, I don't want to say window dressing at best, but that schedule is subject to change. Now, the one thing that we do know, as Kyle said, right, he said that these restrictions are going to be proposed first. And that is really good news. That's going to be the best way, the most concrete way that we're going to have to know what labels are going to be modified and when. Because when, right, a label is modified, first EPA has to propose it. They have to publish it in the Federal Register and make it available and have a period for public comment. And that's a good thing because it gives us all warning about what is going to happen next. So if there's some products that you are very concerned about, I would definitely keep an eye out for those proposals. Again, they're going to be made publicly available. So that's a really great way to be aware that something is coming down the pike.
So that's a great flag, Bridget. And I'll just say Illinois soybean growers is very committed to flagging those as they come up directly to farmers. I think that you mentioned glyphosate. That's probably one of my bigger concerns is what that's going to look like specifically. And so it will be interesting to see how that goes. So Bridget, since you just responded to this and you kind of mentioned this question in your opening statement there, there was one question from the audience. Has any framework been built into the strategy for field enforcement? If yes, what would this start to phase, or how would this start to phase in? I will just share that I attended the state lead agencies. So that's like the Illinois Department of Ag for multiple states meetings 2 weeks ago. And the EPA met with them in detail to talk about herbicide strategy and what that looks like in each state. And I would just say, I mentioned that because in Illinois, IDOA will be responsible for enforcement. And I have a lot of respect for IDOA, and they are in the process of figuring that out. And so hopefully we will hear more Illinois specific. But Dr. Culpepper, Bridget, do you have anything to add to that comment?
Yeah, so I'll just add quickly for Georgia, obviously it's the Georgia Department of Agriculture. What I have already started doing is I am trying to convince my Department of Agriculture to use the calculator as their enforcement tool. If they use the calculator for the enforcement tool, we're all running off the same definitions. We're all running off the same options. And again, we talked about the runoff erosion calculator. I fully expect a particle drift calculator. All right. I'm optimistic again. I'm the optimistic guy here because I want it to calculate it for us so we don't have to worry about if we made a mistake. But I'm going to try my best to convince my Department of Ag if they will use the calculators as the source of an inspection. Keep in mind, at least in my state, inspections are usually the result of us drifting a pesticide, usually a herbicide. And once they get there, they inspect everything. So again, put your products on target and keep them on target. But if they will use the calculator, it's fair play. It's even ground. We all have the opportunity to know what's going to happen, what's coming. And I'm really hoping that at least in our state and many other states will adopt that approach. And it'll help them also learn the process because it's just as complicated, maybe more complicated on our state regulatory partners because they haven't been as engaged as many of us have.
No, I think that's great, Dr. Culpepper. And I think that highlights a lot of this enforcement is going to be done at the state level. I've read the herbicide strategy, the draft herbicide strategy. There's really not a lot that talks about specific enforcement, and certainly not from the federal side. So I think we really are going to see it from the state side. So whoever in your state is responsible for pesticide enforcement, if you're in Illinois, right, Corey just told you, I'd keep an eye on what they're doing, and I would make sure you're part of the conversation.
Can I add just one last quick point on that too? And do tack close to your state grower associations and your state regulators in listening to kind of how this is going to roll out, because I was on a call not long ago with a state regulatory agency that said, well, while we appreciate that EPA is offering a point to growers who keep records on these things, from an enforcement perspective, they're very worried about the impact on their own budgets, on their own workforce for monitoring implementation of this. And so they said one of the things that they're looking at is just making, for ease of implementation and reducing their own burdens, they're looking at the likelihood of making record keeping a requirement in their state for this. And so that is something that we're going to be very mindful to, and kind of what that record keeping burden might look like on individual farms.
No, so that's a great point. And, Dr. Culpepper, I wrote down your comment about your calculator, and I thought, oh, I should share that with IDOA. That would be a key thing. And Kyle, you mentioned something we didn't discuss in detail, but part of the one pathway to getting your 9 points is you can have detailed record keeping. It's up to IDOA to say what that means. But that is a pathway to getting to those 9 points. And I think it might be a very valuable pathway for a lot of our growers. With that, I do want to
I was just going to say the other thing, Corey, if it's done right, you'll be able to print off what you got on the calculator. So there's your record right there, or you can save it down electronically, whatever you want to do. So
yeah,
it's going to be set up to where it can be effective if we're smart enough to work together to make it happen.
I love that. If we're smart enough to work together to make it happen, that's the big goal, right? So transitioning into a little bit of spray drift, one question we had was regarding the spray drift. We have heard and seen material from the EPA that we have to worry about wind direction at the time of entering the field. Can you speak to this a little bit more? If this is the case, this may impact that buffer and the calculation that has to be redone. Calculations will have to be redone. Dr. Culpepper, do you want to address that question?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot, and then Kyle and Bridget, they may have a different opinion. But I think if you look through most of at least herbicide strategy, but even with insecticide strategy, it's really that downwind movement. Now, again, at some point, I think we're going to get a curveball. We all know there's some products out here that are volatile, right? I can't believe that they're going to come in with some of these volatile products and we're all familiar with omnidirectional, right? So I think there will be a curveball at some time, but that curveball has not been set up for us. So right now, the way it's moving forward, it's going to be that downwind buffer. You as the applicator will know which way the wind is blowing once you're in the field. We all know what the wind does when we're in the field. That's going to be your responsibility to handle that. You be creative. But again, if you're in my state, I'm going to try to get you where you don't have a downwind buffer. I'm going to do everything I can, and we're going to focus on the key component of this whole thing with me is nothing but we need to put these products on target, boom height, droplet size. There's 13 other factors. This is something we have to do, and we're capable of doing it.
So I love that comment, Dr. Culpepper. Get you to put it on target, no downward wind buffer needed. That's a great line there. Just kind of building on this, I think this came from a similar place, but I got a text about this too. Just for clarification, all of this is field by field, not overall farm, correct?
Field. It's field. So I'll give you a quick example. Let's say, and I know you guys don't grow cotton, but let's say you got a cotton field beside a soybean field, and we're going to use dual. The use rate, the use pattern, they're different in the cotton field versus the soybean field, right? And then look at soil texture, look at soil slope. It's going to have to be done by field. But again, as I highlighted in there, if we're smart enough, we should be able to group some of our fields or farms. If every field within a farm is exactly the same and you can use those mitigation points to get you to a 9, you can do it as that. But ultimately, you have to make the decision by field, by crop, by product, right? And exactly, I think what Kyle said, somewhere in there, we're going to hit a 9. Most of them, maybe they're all 5 and 6, but we're going to hit a 9. And if we get to 9, we protect that product that we can still use it. And also we protect the pool of pesticide use limitation areas. We protect ourselves from there, right? So, but yes, field, that's what makes this so complicated. But if we're creative, hopefully you don't have 100 different fields. And when I say different, I mean different in the scope of mitigations.
Yeah, I want to just one quick point on that, and I know that we're the topic of the discussion today was herbicide strategy, but I think that this is relevant for insecticide strategy too. Is when we talk to growers who may only experience certain insect pests once every few years, and again, for only for certain crops too. So if you don't have that crop in rotation, you may not be experiencing that insect pest. They also have to be mindful of things that you may experience. Great example is like soybean gall midge, we know has been migrating, across the Midwest, and it pops up in certain areas, where growers haven't experienced that historically. So you need to also kind of sit down and think about, okay, what tools might I need? Because look, if you have a pest crop up in, July or August, and you don't have enough points on that field to treat that pest, we don't know what that looks like. Can you use a product, or do you just got to let your field go? So we're really strongly encouraging. I think, Dr. Culpepper's onto a great point here, is like you need to sit down and really truly think through, like, how do I get my field to a point where I could use any potential tool that I may need to use on it and have those mitigations in place so I'm not going to be caught short if I need to make an application quickly. So that's really how you got to sort of train yourself to start thinking about this. And then, yes, unfortunately, that does have to be on a field by field basis, but there are ways that you can simplify that thinking.
Yeah, and so that's a great comment. And I will just say Illinois Soybean is working on a series of regional talks where we're going to dive into some of these really Illinois specific solutions and maybe help farmers kind of workshop some of these strategies. I think, Dr. Culpepper's mentioned it a couple of times. There, with the right support, there is a pathway where this works for our farmers, where we can deal with this, at least for most of the time. And so the next question I have, this is really specific. So Dr. Culpepper, I'm going to kick it to you. Could you explain the forest/shrubland greater than 60-foot drift mitigation of 100%? Does this count as a buffer, or is this an area we are protecting?
All right, so the way it's defined in herbicide strategy, at least now, if you have at least a shrubland or forest, for me, it's pine trees. But if you have at least a 60-foot wide, let's use my example, pine tree forest surrounding my field, which if you looked at my map, that's what you saw. And the height of that shrubland or pine tree is at least twice of that of the boom. I get 100% reduction. So what I have, no matter what my number is, if that field is surrounded by that forest at least 60-foot wide and at least twice as high, I basically don't have an infield buffer, right? So that is huge. That is absolutely huge for the Southeast and all the pine trees. But yes, that is a percent reduction in the infield or the buffer that you would need. So that's what that is. And again, there are other examples that you need to get on the calculators when they come, or get on herbicide strategy. I just highlighted most of those that are important for my growers, because I'm going to simplify the process and throw out all those mitigations that aren't relevant to my growers.
I know in Illinois, shrubland/forest buffers are not as common probably as they are in Georgia. But I will say, I guess one question I did have, just kind of building on that, was does that have to be omnidirectional, or is it just a downwind?
So if we have a product and it's downwind, that is what you need, right? That is all you need. You only need it to be downwind. So now everybody says, this is some of the things you deal with. Everybody says, well, you can just go pick the day the wind's blowing the right way. No, right? That don't happen. We don't have the ability to do that, right? But yes, if you do have the ability to pick the day the wind's blowing that way, that is certainly an option for you. Now, I don't know any farm that has the capability of doing that, but that is an option available.
Okay, fair point, fair point. So this next question, it gets into a really fun topic. Would this also apply to dicamba restrictions as well, regarding endangered species and label changes? So I see a lot of smiles because everybody on this call loves to talk about dicamba. I will just real fast. Bridget, can you share with us where the dicamba label situation is?
Yep.
How is it allowed to be used on soybeans and corn right now?
Right now, if we're talking over the top applications of dicamba, not really at all. There are no products currently registered for over the top use on any crop. So just know if you do use it in that way, that is an off-label use. It is a violation of federal law, and you could face some consequences for that. As far as how this could apply to future over-the-top dicamba registrations, right now, we have seen labels submitted by both Bayer and BASF, and I want to say there was a third one submitted. Yes, Kyle is nodding his head yes. He's had more coffee than me this morning and can remember the third one. Um, so there are, yeah, this cup, while big, is not nearly big enough. So we do have new labels that have been submitted. However, those are currently being reviewed by EPA for registration. And what do we know from the draft herbicide strategy? It's that these new restrictions are going to start appearing on labels for newly registered products. We're going to have to consider these newly registered products, which means that if or when these labels are approved, and I know I'm using scary if words, but I think we just kind of have to be aware, right, that anything could happen. We should expect to see the herbicide strategy applied to any new label registrations. And I'll kick it over to Kyle too, because I know his team has been watching this closely.
Yeah, I mean, perfect, Bridget. You think you handled that perfectly. The only additional comment I'd make is that all three of those proposed registrations included ESA, restrictions that are not, I mean, the herbicide strategy wasn't finalized until after all three of those registrations were proposed, but they tacked pretty closely with what otherwise would have been included in the herbicide strategy. So, when we do see a new registration, we expect that it will include those ESA mitigations.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to be aware of. Yep, it's the timing of all
So,
of this.
Yeah, so this is one of the ones I'm interested in, and this is something Kyle and I talk about a lot. So I have 9 counties, right? Before we lost the products, that my buffers were 310 downwind and 57 omnidirectional. Now the herbicide strategy is proposing it'll be somewhere between 0 and 230. All right, I'm having a hard time believing that, right? So that is why we need some of these labels to move forward so we understand exactly what we've got. And this is the one I am most interested in. And I'll publicly thank Kyle and his group, as well as Cotton, and all the work that they're trying to do to get us this tool back. It's very important to Georgia. There's no doubt about it. And we're doing everything that we can. But that highlights the document that we have versus the reality of what we're going to get. That is going to be a big day to understand what kind of restrictions they have. Because actually, if they follow the herbicide strategy, we will have less restrictions in a lot of my counties than we currently do, or we did before we lost those products. And the other one's Tavium, by the way.
So that's a good I guess place to kind of wrap our conversation is with dicamba. I like to end all conversations with dicamba. It's just an exciting space. I will say, just to clarify, there is use of dicamba in corn and pre-plant still on label. It's just over the top soybeans and cotton for people who care about cotton. But so I just want to be specific about that. And right now, the outlook for those re-registrations getting approved by the EPA in time for the 2025 growing season is pretty we never know what's going to happen, but it's pretty low. It's a pretty unlikely outlook, I think, is what I classify. I see Bridget making this small sign with their hands. So guys, I just want to say I really appreciate this panel discussion. I appreciate a couple key points. One is, we can survive the herbicide strategy. With intentionality and planning, we can get there. We need key support from grower organizations. Our farmers need key support from grower organizations and from Illinois Extension, Illinois DOA, as well as some of the other organizations to help us plan and meet these requirements, but it's something that can be achieved. And so I really love that. Hold on, I was wrapping, but it looks like, oh, I got a correction. Brian Young from Purdue corrected me. Dicamba products are available for post-use in corn and other crops. The labels are vacated only pertaining to dicamba products for extend crops. So thank you, Brian, for correcting me there. But I always want to be accurate when I'm sharing this information. So sorry for that inaccuracy. But anyway, that said, I really appreciate this. I think there was a lot of great takeaways. The slide set and the recording of this meeting will be shared after in the coming days with everyone who registered, and it will be available online to be viewed as well. So with that, thank you very much. I just want to give a round of applause to our panelists and our great audience questions. Thank you very much, guys.